of Summit Performance Consulting, where she works with Division I athletes, Division I teams, including Olympic hopefuls. We're really excited that Em is bringing her expertise to us today. So I'm going to hand it over to her, and you can get started, Em.
Okay, thank you, Kayleen. Welcome over to the teachers who I'm seeing from our last session, and welcome new to you parents who are here. Like I said last time, I met Kayleen in college, and that was my first introduction to this wonderful sport that you are all a part of. And like I said before, I've come to really respect the competitiveness and the tight-knit community that you have. And I will say with parents, I've seen Kayleen operate both as like more of a dance parent and more of a dance teacher. And I know you parents have a lot going on with preparing your sons and daughters to get ready to compete. One of my first introductions to Kayleen and sports was her referring to basketball jerseys as costumes, I think. Is that right, Kayleen? So that started my journey with learning about this about this sport and this culture. But today we're going to be focusing on kind of parenting through a pandemic. I'm kind of shifting over from the teacher's talk to be a little bit more on kind of the emotional end of what's going on. So you as parents, you know your children better than anyone else. Hopefully they have a great relationship with their teachers, but you know them better than anyone else. And I think for a lot of us parents, we recognize we can kind of take the emotional brunt of a lot of what our sons and daughters are going through. You're kind of the sounding board. You know, sometimes it can feel like we're more emotional punching bags, but I'm gonna dig in a little bit to more of the emotional end of what's going on here that your sons and daughters might be experiencing right now, and what are some tangible things that you can do to be dealing with that. So here is our outline for today. We're going to be talking through the stages of grief. I know that can sound a little intense, but when I'm working with injured athletes, essentially what's going on is a removal from their sport in the way they're used to engaging in their sport. And so what I've seen over the past few months is what performers are experiencing really sometimes matches this movement through the stages of grief. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Expectations and motivation, what you can do at home, what you can do as a parent to help mitigate some of these things. And finally, resilient coping. So we talked in the teacher session a lot about resilience and how to develop that, but kind of on the home front, how can you as a parent help your child identify some of his or her coping skills and how to put those into action. And I think Kayleen will be kind of fielding any questions that you guys have throughout this to type into the chat box, because I'm just going to sort of power through. So go right ahead and throw your questions in the chat box if you have them. Okay, so I want to start off with some myths about grief. These are things that I hope that you as parents understand on your own, but that if you're recognizing these things in your children, that you can bring these to their attention. So really what's going on right now with a lot of athletes who are removed from their sport, or removed from competition the way they're used to engaging in it. So even if you're still showing up for these Zoom calls, you're still interacting with your teacher, they're still getting this opportunity to dance and to be instructed, they're still not being able to engage in the sport the way they're used to. And they're probably grieving the loss of competitions throughout the rest of this year. So a myth about grief is that moving on means you don't care. So deciding, okay, I'm just going to accept that this is what's going on and I need to move forward and figure out what is dancing going to look like for me for the remainder of 2020 and going into 2021. Taking that step doesn't mean that they don't care. So making sure you make that clear, especially if they're moving forward and some of their dancing friends are not yet. If you don't cry or if you don't get really emotional about it, it means you don't care. That's also not the case. I'm sure we all know, you might think of your son or daughter and think, oh yeah, she's so emotional, or he's so this or that. Maybe I've never seen my daughter shed a tear. Okay, so just trying to figure out what that looks like for your own child. And finally, that there's a specific normal amount of time to grieve something, that's also not the case. Okay, so you really want to encourage your children to talk about what it is they're going through. And that can be as simple as just asking them, like, what do you think about this? How are you handling this? You know, what are your feelings? And trying to ask them in open-ended ways, not like, are you sad? Are you frustrated? But really, you know, when you think about not getting to compete, how does that feel? Or what do you think about with that? And really try to gauge where they are. So what I'm going to do here is talk about what these 5 stages of grief are. A point to remember is that we don't necessarily progress from 1 to 5 right off the bat. You might get to 4 and bump back to 2. You might, you know, make your way to 2 and go right back to denying that this is even going on, okay? So keep that in mind, that it's not necessarily a linear process, but ultimately you do tend to move through all the way to the end. So my hope here is to explain to you what your child might be thinking or saying in some of these stages so that you get an understanding of where they are. Because understanding where they are is going to dictate how you try to support them. So denial is like this can't be happening. This isn't happening. I can't believe we don't get to compete. You know, this just isn't real. So maybe that's something you're recognizing happened a month ago or a few months ago with your children. Then anger. You know, why is this happening? You're really frustrated. You're upset. Moving into bargaining. And that's kind of this idea of, you know, dear God, if you do this for me, I will, you know, if you bring our competitions back, if you make COVID go away, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Okay, you're making this bargaining. You know, none of it ever really makes sense. It's not totally rational, but that's our emotional brain in hyperdrive. Okay. And so what you move on into seeing is the depression. And that might be a stage where a lot of you are recognizing your kids are. And it doesn't necessarily, I'm not talking about our kids necessarily being clinically depressed, but it's really when you start to see you're really sad and you're bummed out. Maybe you're recognizing your kids aren't as engaged in the sport as they used to be. This is a point where it's really important to make sure that you're reaching out, you're being supportive, you're being really deliberate with the things that you say to make sure that they don't lose their motivation for the sport, that they don't become totally disengaged from the sport. And then finally moving into acceptance and accepting this is what's going on, I'm at peace with it, and so now I can kind of move forward. So what I'd like for you to do right now to get a sense of what you're going through at home, try to gauge where you think your child is right now in these stages and type that in, because I'm just curious to see, maybe everybody has sort of accepted this. Maybe you're all like, they're just totally still in denial. Give me a sense of how to give some guidance as we move forward. Acceptance, great. Depression, yep. Sometimes I find myself there, yep. Okay, a lot more of that. Anger and depression, yep. Yeah, okay. And so recognizing, you know, you have two different aged children who are in different situations with this, right? Okay. Yeah, so everybody is at really different stages. And if I were to ask you this question, I wonder where we would be. Okay, whether I'm talking about you personally, you professionally, or you as a parent, you know, where are you in your process of dealing with this loss for your child? Because I know that that can be really heavy, you know, especially if your child is really committed to this sport and now he can't compete anymore. How does that feel for you to have to watch your child be depressed, as you're saying, to be going back and forth between anger and depression, as I've seen some of you say? You know, that can be really hard on us as parents as well. The point I really want to drive home here is that when you're in those first 3 stages, it's just really important to listen. So if you have a child that's in the anger stage and she's saying, this is so unfair, blah, 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 it's not helpful because he's not ready to hear you. It's not helpful when you say, life isn't fair. Or, yeah, well, some people can't dance at all. Some people don't get to do this or that. Some people don't have a computer to be able to do a virtual Zoom, right? They're not ready to hear that. So in those first 3 stages, it's just really important to listen. When you a lot of you wrote, I think my child is kind of in this depression phase. That's when it's important to listen, but also to start really reaching out. Demonstrate that you're supporting them by saying things like, I hear you. Yeah, this seems really hard. It's hard for me to watch you going through this too. Yeah, I know this is so disappointing. Try to be with them in whatever those feelings are that they're bringing up. And then start to little by little offer, what can I do to help? Okay, how can I support you? And sometimes it's going to be, I need you to not talk to me about this, or I'll come to you when I'm ready, right? But you've kind of planted that seed. You've let them know that you're there. You've let them know that you're supporting them. That can even be, who can support you? So if you don't want to talk to me about this, who can you talk to about it? Making sure that you're helping them identify who their support network is. And maybe it's other dancers, maybe it's their teacher, maybe it's just other friends outside of this world. And finally, when you get into acceptance, that's when you can start moving into some of these conversations about expectations that we're going to move into right now. Okay, so acceptance is kind of the ultimate goal when we're moving through the grief process, okay? Acceptance means not resisting the situation, not denying the circumstances that we're dealing with right now. It just means accepting what we're going through so that we can move forward, okay? And getting to that acceptance point is really crucial because it helps you start to manage your expectations. As we'll see here, our expectations are part of an overall cycle that leads to what our performance is. And for our purposes here, performance to me right now is, yes, not only how is their dance performance, are they progressing, how are they dancing, but their performance here is also, I think, in this pandemic, needs to include their engagement in the sport and kind of their commitment still to the sport. I think that that's an added piece we need to think about here. So once your child is able to accept what it is we're going through, you can talk with them about having a realistic conversation about expectations. Okay, so what are your expectations right now for what you're going to get out of dance, what you're going to be able to be getting out of this sport, what you're going to get from your teachers? Okay, and so I think a big piece here is, what are your expectations for your own progression and your own improvement? So if I think I'm not going to be able to compete until January, until July, what's my expectation for how much better I can get between now and then? Okay, so that's within their control, and it's very process oriented. It doesn't have to do with being able to compete on a larger stage, to be able to attend these competitions, because as we all know, they're canceled. So having a conversation about what your expectations are and how you can set expectations that are going to lead to increasing this effort. Okay, so if my expectation is I don't get to compete for a year, and without being able to be around my teacher and my class in person, I'm not going to make any gains. I'm not going to improve. We're not going to see a whole lot of effort from your child put into dance. And without that effort put in, without that motivation there, the performance gains are not going to be there either. So having that conversation about expectations, recognizing how realistically how much you think that you can improve over time, and making those expectations very controllable and process related, that opens the door to having a lot more effort put in, having more motivation and more engagement in the sport, which will lead to hopefully better performance. And again, like I said, I think that that just needs to include progress and engagement in the sport right now. So along with that effort, what's really important is motivation. So are they motivated to put in that effort? So for you teachers who were with us before, these next two slides will be familiar to you, and hopefully you have a really good idea of these. But motivation is basically our drive to put forth effort to accomplish something. Motivation exists on a continuum from intrinsic motivation or internal motivation to extrinsic or external. So we'll talk about each here, starting with this intrinsic or internal motivation. So this is completely within your child's control. Okay, so this is those of you who have children who are motivated to have fun. You know, maybe for those of you who have different age kids, maybe you recognize, you know, the younger ones, they really just want to have fun when they're out there dancing. My older one is a little bit more about winning and how he actually does when he gets out to compete. But this intrinsic is you want to learn new things. You want to feel a sense of belonging and be connected to a group. You want to improve relative to yourself and have fun. This, in our situation right now, this is kind of an ideal type of motivation because we can still sustain these things on an individual level. What's harder, and what I'm sure a lot of you are seeing right now, is for those of you who recognize that you have children who are really extrinsically motivated. So really motivated by external factors. So they love competing. They love the feeling of getting up there, the butterflies in their stomach. They want to win. They want to be the best. They love getting that pat on the back from teacher, hearing that praise. And that's great, but we're not able to get a lot of that right now without having competitions. And ultimately, that's also not totally within their control. So they can do everything they need to do to prepare. They can go out, they can dance an excellent dance, but it also really matters how did the other competitors perform and how did the judges judge everyone, right? So it's not totally within their control. It's really important to have a combination of both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, because what you'll find is having these big picture extrinsic motivators is important for really driving us forward, keeping things interesting, having something big that we're working toward. But you also want to be intrinsically motivated as well. Have these things that are within our control. No matter how other dancers are dancing, no matter what the judges do, I still know that I've mastered this new step. I still know that I'm really having fun while I dance. You know, these things that you can check the box on your own. So I'm sure some of you are recognizing right now, kind of putting your children into these boxes or thinking, you know, I think my kid does actually have a nice mix of these. But what we're finding is that this extrinsic motivation is getting increasingly difficult to tap into right now. So like I said with the teacher presentation, it's really important at home to try to create the environment for your child to motivate himself or herself, okay? And to do that, just talk to your child. So we talked about this with the parents. What is this, or excuse me, the teachers, what does this look like for you? But with parents, you're with your kids all the time. Now more than ever. With my kids more than I ever anticipated I would be at this point. So just have a really direct conversation. Talk with them about, you know, what motivates you, okay? And how can I help? I know this is hard. I know that you like to be able to compete, but that's not on the table right now. You know, this can come up in the expectations talk. So what are some do's and don'ts? What do you want me to say to you? What do you not want me to say to you? Right? When I want to come and talk to you, when will you be receptive to this? Right? So you might think, you know, my son never wants to talk to me in the morning, or, you know, he's trying to do this or he's trying to do that, and that's not a great time for this conversation. Like I said, you know them better than anyone. So have those conversations, really try to navigate this. How can you use your role as parent, being around your children all the time, to help support the teachers who are trying to keep these kids motivated? Okay, so how can you try to create that environment as well with what you're doing and what you're saying? And that starts with having conversations with your children to find out what motivates them and what you can do to help, or when you need to back off, really. Okay, so we're going to move in a little bit to talking about resilient coping. So with the teachers, I talked about how motivation is a really big topic that keeps coming up in this pandemic, but I also think it's really important that we talk about resilience and how to find some sort of silver lining in all of this adversity and all of this stress we're experiencing. And that silver lining is the opportunity to develop resilience. I really like this quote: "The oak fought the wind and was broken. the willow bent when it must and survived. So right now we all need to be these willows. We need to bend, we need to adapt, we need to change what we're doing in order to survive, in order to stay engaged in the sport, in order to keep our kids engaged in the sport, okay? This really speaks to me when I think about resilience, because resilience is ultimately our ability to bounce back from stress and adversity. So our ability to bend when we have to and bounce back and come back from things. So this might be a lot that I'm throwing at you with this slide, but ultimately, we all experience stress all the time. Stress does not necessarily have to be a bad thing. Depends on a lot of different factors. But when we experience stress, we internalize that in some way. We integrate that in some way, okay? These are 4 different ways that we can kind of integrate that stress. So what we're hoping for is this resilient integration. What we might be seeing a lot of right now is this maladaptive integration. And so what I mean with that is basically your kids are going to have a takeaway from this experience no matter what. So the question is that going to be a productive, resilient takeaway? Is that going to be, are they just kind of going to stay in the same spot? But here with this maladaptive integration, that's that you make it through this stress, you make it through this adversity, but you lose protective factors along the way. So what I mean with protective factors is a real passion for sport, a real passion for dance. So that can be kind of this buffer, this motivator, or this protective factor when you're losing competitions that you expected to win, when you're not progressing at the rate you expected to progress, when you sprain your ankle and you have to miss a competition, right? So that passion for sport can be something that pushes you and drives you through those experiences and really motivates you to stay engaged, okay? If your dancers and if your children are experiencing this stress and they're losing some of those protective factors, what I mean is they could be losing passion for the sport. And that means when we come out of this, they might not be as engaged in the sport, okay? But if we're intentional with how we're talking with them about these experiences, how we're talking with them about the stress that they're experiencing, we can help them integrate and sort of internalize the stress in a more resilient way. So that's making it through adversity and actually gaining protective factors. So how can they develop coping skills or sort of tap into their coping skills throughout this experience to make sure that they are being more resilient in response to this stress? So hopefully this makes sense. If you have questions, please feel free to type them in. But basically, my overall point here is that no matter what, if you do nothing, if you say nothing, your kids are going to be integrating this stress. So you have the opportunity to try to dictate how they bring that stress into their life. And they could bring that stress into their life in a way that says, this situation is really hard, but I have to experience hard things to be someone who knows how to persevere, to be someone who knows how to be gritty and to be resilient. And in order for them to bring that stress into their lives in that more resilient way, you have to help them process that. You have to help them talk about it and figure out how to move through this experience. So a big part of that is talking about coping skills. Ultimately, coping is conscious and effortful efforts to deal with the perceived demands of a situation. So stress is basically perceiving that our coping skills don't meet a certain demand or our resources don't meet the demand. I'm sure we're all experiencing stress every day. So maybe I feel I don't have enough time to get this done, or I don't have the skill set I need to get this thing done. That's where stress arises. Okay. So if right now your children are thinking, I don't have the motivators I need to get this done, to stay engaged, how can you help them tap into some of that motivation, tap into some of that intrinsic motivation a little bit better? A big part of being resilient in this experience is identifying what those coping skills are. Coping skills can change our appraisal of a stressor, which can change our response to it. So basically what I mean with that is if you sit down and you talk with your child when you're really stressed, how can you handle that? Okay, yeah, sometimes I see that you take some deep breaths before you had to get up on stage, and that really helped you. Sometimes I see you kind of shake out your nerves. I know that you've said sometimes the night before a competition, you use visualization, or you just like to call a friend and talk on the phone to take your focus off of things and to de-stress. All of those are really great examples of coping skills. So you as a parent can use your role and your access to your son or daughter to help them identify those coping skills that they already have and help them see how they can apply them to this situation to integrate this adversity in a more resilient way. So what we find with resilient coping is that you have task-oriented coping strategies and more emotion-oriented coping strategies. So our task-oriented ones are when we actually have some control over changing a situation that causes the stress. I would argue that right now there's not a whole lot individually that people can be doing to change the situation that's causing the stress right now. I mean, even if we just boil this down to how the pandemic is affecting how your son and daughter get to dance, there's really not a whole lot we can change about that. So a lot of your focus will be on emotion-oriented coping strategies. So how can you talk with your son and daughter about using coping skills that can change their emotional response to this situation right now? So these are examples of various coping skills that you can use or that your children can be using to deal with some of the adversity that they're dealing with right now. So I'm going to go through some of these and kind of ask you to reflect on what do you think are some of the strategies that your kids are using right now. So activation management, that ultimately means dealing with nerves. Okay, so I like to talk about nerves as not necessarily being bad for performance, but it depends on how you interpret them. So if your child gets really nervous before she gets to compete, talking with her that those nerves might just be your body getting ready to go, okay? Obviously, they're not going to be able to experience competition right now, but if they feel any stress going into classes, if they feel the stress of just this situation, you can talk to them about how they're managing that. Using visualization and imagery. So this could be really helpful right now, is just actually being able to picture what it'll be like when they get to compete again. Okay. And also picturing when you do get to compete again, you're probably going to feel a lot of pressure because it's the first time you've gotten to compete in a long time. Okay. You can talk to them about what their self-talk is. So yes, the situation is really stressful. Yes, it might not be as fun if you have to be dancing from behind a computer screen, but what are the kinds of things that you're saying to yourself? Okay. Are you telling yourself, this is terrible, this is no fun? Or are you saying, this is different, I have to adapt, let's see how I can handle it today? Okay. Focusing on goals. So we talked about this a little bit with the intrinsic motivation, but goals gives you something that you can control, something more process related that you can focus on. Goals are an example of a coping skill. Okay, so you can try to use your role as a parent to sit down with your child and talk about what are your goals for this week? What are your goals for this time period where you can't compete? How do you want to stay engaged in the sport? What kind of progress do you want to see in your dancing? What kind of progress do you want to see in your relationship with your teacher, in your relationship with your peers? Refocusing and positive reappraisal, excuse me, that's really important right now. Okay, so talking with them about how they can have more of a challenge mindset. I talked about this with the teachers, but that's ultimately recognizing that there's not just one way to view a situation. Okay, and you can change your mindset to sort of change your perspective. You can look at an obstacle and try to turn that into an opportunity. So having conversations like that with your child, like, what's the obstacle right now? Okay, how can that be an opportunity? So you can't compete right now. What opportunity does that open up for you? It gives me an opportunity to re-engage with my process of how I do things. It is making me tap into my purpose. Why do I do what I do? So these are various coping skills that you can talk through with your child, but ultimately using your role right now to help your child be resilient is all about getting them to identify the coping skills that they use right now, or the coping skills that they've used for other situations, and how they can apply that to what they're going through right now. So basically you have your teachers who are trying to motivate, who are trying to keep your child on track with what he or she needs to be doing in the dancing world. And your role at home is basically to be supporting all of that work, but you're doing it on a much more personal level. Okay, and a big part of that is you kind of facilitating conversations and trying to recognize your child doing things right, if that makes sense. So ultimately helping them integrate this stress in a way that helps them come out more resilient, and by using coping skills and identifying their coping skills to do so. So that's about one, identification of those coping skills, but two, when do they apply them, and how can you sort of reinforce your child using those coping skills, if that makes sense. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to wrap up. I wanted to leave a little bit more time for Q&A because I know that in my experience with speaking with parents, I get a lot of questions. I know every child is different, so I wanted to have a little bit more of opportunity to answer some of your specific individual questions if you want to jump into that, Kayleen.
Yeah, thank you, Em. Yep, so I think for the remainder of the time, we'll do a little Q&A. If you have a question, go ahead and type it into the chat, or go ahead and raise your hand. Use the hand raise function, and KCM will unmute you if you want to ask Em and speak to her directly. We'll do it either way. To get us started, actually bouncing off of a comment from Jessica, how do we handle the no end game? You know, I think we've seen our kids enter the depression phase as competitions get canceled and the next one gets canceled, and then, you know, the next performance opportunity gets canceled. And we can't really tell them when they will perform, you know, outside of a computer again. So how do we handle the no end game?
Yeah. So I think one of the hardest things right now is the uncertainty. So physiologically, when we experience a lot of uncertainty, what happens is that our emotional brain just takes over our logical and more rational brain. We feel really emotional. Our decisions and sort of our thought processes are really emotion driven. And what's helpful is to try to find a way to switch our rational brain back on. And we can do that with asking the right kinds of questions or sort of redirecting some things. But a lot of what's going on right now, because we as the grown-ups, the adults in the situation, are also really grappling with this uncertainty. And as parents and as teachers, we want to have all the answers, but we don't have the answers. And kind of relinquishing that feeling of control can be really difficult for a lot of us. But ultimately, what's most important is for you to just continue to be honest with your kids. Obviously, depending on their age and sort of their development, you'll make the judgment calls about how much information is appropriate to share. But I think that being honest about not knowing when competitions will come back is important. And I think that you can model the kinds of coping that you want to see in your child, and that can be really valuable. So if you say, I don't know when competition is going to come back, and not knowing that is really hard for me, right? I'm a little bit stressed out about it, or I'm really bummed out about it. Like, how do you feel about this? And so bringing things back to what you can actually control in a situation can help kind of mitigate that emotional response to all of the uncertainty. So if you talk through, you know, I don't know when things are going to come back. This is hard. It really bums me out. But if you don't get to compete in the next few months, like, what can you still be doing with dance? What goals can you still have? What gains do you want to see? You can ask questions like, if you see yourself, if we fast forward to the end of October, if we fast forward to the end of December, what can you have done that will make you feel like you accomplished something? Okay, so asking those kinds of questions that can be answered with controllable things. Okay, so by the end of October, I'd really like to improve this step. All right, so let's write that down. Let's give you something, a way that you can sort of assess your progress, feel like you've accomplished something, still have something to go on. I know that that's really hard. I know we all want to be able to hear, well, competitions are going to be back, so we don't have to worry about this. But our kids are dealing with everything that we're dealing with on their own smaller level, but with a lot less life experience and coping skills. So try to reflect a little bit on that. Like, how does this feel for you? And your kids are probably feeling the same way, but with way fewer skills to deal with it. And I think asking those kinds of questions and helping them be like process focused and really concrete can be helpful with younger kids.
That's great. Here's a great question. And should I, as a parent, be goal setting with our teacher alongside my dancer, or is that a personal? How involved should I be right now?
That's a really good question. I think that really depends on the teacher. It really depends on the student. I think that you can ask, maybe Kayleen, correct me if I'm wrong because you have both hats on, but I think that a good rule of thumb is to actually ask the teacher about that. And just asking the question, how can I support you? Okay, because I'm sure a lot of us have had the experience where you say one thing or you give your child this advice, they shrug it off, they roll their eyes at you, and then you turn around and the teacher says something, or their teacher at school or their coach, and they take it to heart like it's just absolute gold that they've just been told. And you're like, I just told you that, right? Sometimes as a parent, your child doesn't interact with you quite the same way as they do with a teacher. So this question there might go to the teacher, how can I support what you're doing? With, of course, understanding that you know your child better than anyone, but just opening up those lines of communication, asking the question, how can I help? What am I going to do that's not going to be helpful? And then really try to commit to those things. If you're committed to helping your child through the process, commit to doing whatever it is, whatever feedback you get from that.
Thank you. Here's the next one. My daughter is getting frustrated because she feels like everyone else is handling the switch to Zoom classes better than she is. What can I tell her to keep her from comparing herself to other dancers?
Yeah. Okay. So that's so normal. And the comparison can be really hard, especially for young girls, and how particularly girls' sources of motivation and where their sources of self-esteem come from. So one thing I would say is asking your daughter, when you get into a Zoom call or Zoom class, how do you act? Like, you feel like it's really hard and you don't like it as much, you're not as mentally engaged. Do you think that your peers recognize that? Or do you kind of show up and put a smile on your face and everything is great? So kind of the first step is, if you're comparing yourself to your peers, think about how they're presenting themselves, okay? Because we can only see what we see. We don't know what people are thinking. We don't know people's motivations. We don't know what they're going through at any given time, right? So I would first try to start increasing their perspective of the situation by thinking, if you present yourself as everything is great and fine, your peers might be doing the same thing. But you also might decide, why don't you ask your teacher if you can have a little time during a class, or if you can connect with some of your peers via email and say, how is everybody doing? Something really simple like that. Then you'll start to realize not everybody is actually doing quite as well with this. But that aside, we can only control what we control. So if your daughter or son is not handling things as well as other people are, another way to go about that might be, well, why do we think that is? And what are some ways we think that you can start handling this Zoom stuff a little better? What are these coping skills like we're talking about? How can we integrate this stress that you're dealing with in a more resilient way? So you can talk with her about, okay, what can we do? What's one thing we can do today that'll help you enjoy this a little bit more? Trying to get her to identify what skills she has, what coping skills she has to try to deal with that. But I ultimately think it is, I know, probably frustrating, because I'm sure you can say time and time again that comparisons don't help, but we make comparisons to ourselves and others all the time. I'm sure as a parent, you might see yourself, you might be driving down the street and see some happy looking family strolling along, or some mom in the grocery store who's got 3 kids and she seems like she's got everything all figured out. And really she gets into her car and screams or starts to have a breakdown because she's so stressed out, right? We as adults are also making those comparisons. So we need to think about that as well, that our kids are dealing with the things that we're dealing with on a lower level. So helping them identify the skills that they have to deal with things and try to think about things in ways that bring it back to focusing on themselves and what they can control, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Here's one. My daughter is a beginner, and without the next competition to work towards, is bribing to practice okay?
So this is a good question, and it all comes back to motivation. And this idea of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation comes up a lot, especially with younger athletes and competitors. So the ideal response to this is that we should be really trying to cultivate that intrinsic motivation. That's ideal, right? So that's not always the reality, but I will say you need to make that decision based on what you think works for your child. So have there been times where you've done some sort of bribe system for some other kind of behavioral thing in the past and it's been successful? If that's the case, let's, consider that as something you're keeping on the table. If you're concerned about it, you might want to just try to be reinforcing intrinsic motivation. And to be reinforcing intrinsic motivation, you want to think about the questions you're asking. So what was fun about today? What did you learn about today? Who did you connect with today? Or did your teacher say anything funny? Or did another student do this or that? Trying to reinforce that connection to those intrinsic motivators we talked about, learning new things, improving relative to themselves. So that might be something too. Maybe the bribe kind of comes from, it's not necessarily a bribe, but it's a reward for controllable personal improvements. But I have to say, even being a sports psych, this time we're living in is bonkers. And if you know that your child under normal circumstances would really enjoy this sport and you just want to keep him or her in it, I'm sort of like, whatever gets you through the day at this point.
As this continues, how can we support coping fatigue, which I assume will start to arise?
COVID fatigue? Is that what you said, Kay?
Coping fatigue, like continuing to deal with this situation.
Mm-hmm. So I sort of see anything that we're doing mentally, and I think that all of these coping things would fall into that category. We have to treat the same way we treat physical things. So I don't think anyone would expect your dancers to go in and be dancing via Zoom 8 hours a day, day after day after day. You would think to yourself like, oh my God, they're going to get completely physically worn out. They're going to be totally exhausted. The way we kind of exercise our mental muscle is the same way. So we need to give ourselves breaks. We need to have some time off. We need to allow ourselves some recovery. So you might just work some things in there. Maybe once a week you have a time at dinner, you have like for a little bit on the weekend, you decide, this Saturday, we're really going to give ourselves an opportunity to talk about how much this stinks. We're just going to sit in it and we're going to say, I wish I could do this. I wish I could do that. Allow yourself a break from coping. Let yourself actually deal with the fact that this is all unprecedented and it really stinks, right? So just like you would let yourself lie around on the couch, kind of stretch out and let your body recover, think about like, what is almost the opposite of coping? letting myself sit with this emotion, letting myself have kind of a controlled, safe space to vent. So it's not something that becomes a cycle. It's not something that you're doing all the time, but it's basically like we're identifying this as actually like a helpful thing we're doing for our emotional and our mental processing of the situation, is letting ourselves sit down and have a little like coping recovery, a little coping rest, and kind of vent about the situation. I really think that that can be very helpful for people.
I think we'll take this one last question, which is a really good one, and I'm struggling with it myself as well. The question is, I struggle getting my 7-year-old to transition from unstructured free time to practice time. What are some ways I can help prepare her for this time of structure and focus?
Great question. So I think it's a lot about routine. I think that kids really pick up on what is the word I'm looking for? It's sort of like a trigger. Okay, so for example, I have 3 young kids. So when I was like, it's bedtime. Okay, we're gonna do a bath, then we're gonna brush your teeth, then it's gonna be time for books, and then you know that you're gonna have to be really relaxed and fall asleep, right? So that's kind of like a one thing after another to the ultimate goal of being restful and falling asleep. So if you're finding that your child is having a hard time transitioning into that, think about like, what does the lead up into that look like? And if you can start with that, with identifying like, so what is hard about it? Okay, so he has a hard time actually like focusing in. So maybe what I need to do is 30 minutes leading up to it, start pulling away some of those distractors. Start like kind of quieting her mind, getting her a little bit ready for this. Like, what can that 30 minutes before a class look like leading up into that? Of course, I know that sometimes we're running from here to there, even though we can hardly go anywhere. You know, it's not always the case that I have this 30 minutes of leisure time where I can implement these triggers that are going to get her ready. But think about having some sort of consistent routine leading into a class. And of course you might be thinking, well, I always say 20 minutes till this, or time to get in what you need to be wearing, like time to change, make sure you're drinking water, whatever that might be. But it also might be really helpful to think like, what are the specific obstacles when my child is in this class? Is it focus? Is it that they're really tired, whatever that might be, and be intentional with working that in to kind of your triggers. And when we're talking about really young kids, it's going to look different day to day, obviously. And I think what's important is that you, as the adult, remain consistent with what you're doing, remain consistent with preparing them and with how you kind of talk to them afterward. And I think that we can sort of create a really motivating environment when we notice our kids. So with that 7-year-old, if you're thinking, after her class, I'm going to say, wow, I saw you do this. Or like, wow, you look really happy right now. Did you have a fun time? Like, why was today so fun? So you start to sort of infuse some of that excitement into it. And you might recognize that your kids get a little bit more excited on the front end because they don't know what to expect, or they're waiting to have kind of that fun experience again.
Thank you, Emily. This was so wonderful and such good questions. I want to thank all of the parents that joined us, and especially all the teachers that committed to, hearing this content from a teacher perspective and then staying on and wearing that parent role, as a lot of people do in this sport. I know that the ScotDance USA Marketing Promotions Committee, Professional Development Committee, and board want to continue to do things to support our parents, and because you really are a huge part of the team in keeping your dancers motivated, especially now. So be on the lookout for more things that will be coming for our parent community. I'll also be sending out Emily's contact information and her website. They do really amazing webinars. You can check out their website for more content, or reach out to Em personally. She does work one-on-one with athletes. Remind your dancers, or save the date for August 15th. That's our next complimentary Zoom class. It's musical theater with Jennifer Miller Combs. It'll be a lot of fun. It's a way to keep our dancers getting together and dancing. So again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and thank you, Em, for all of this wonderful content, great information. And have a great rest of your Saturday. Bye, everyone.
Bye.